Hi, this is Misha. In our kind of continuing revisiting of all the different major military bolt-action rifles from World War I and World War II, this series is on the Russian M1891 three-line rifle, commonly referred to in the USA as the Mosin-Nagant, and in Russia, while unofficially as the Mosin rifle. Now there's a lot of good videos and a lot of information out on the Mosin because of how many are in the USA, so I'm not going to even attempt to repeat it all here. Check that out. CN Arsenal has a couple of good videos on the Mosin, as does Forgotten Weapons and many other places, and plenty of articles too, but it was worth revisiting. So for the first section, I have my 1915 Infantry Rifle. This is about 51.5 inches long overall and has a 31.5 inch barrel. This is about the longest version ever made. It fires the 7.62 by 54 rimmed cartridge, which many are familiar with, from a single stack box magazine. Also on the table, I have a Dragoon Rifle, or at least an ex-Dragoon. This one was originally made in 1927 as a Dragoon, and then it went through the 9130 update process. However, the 9130 is very heavily based on the Dragoon, and we'll get into that in the 9130 video. But sorry, I don't have an altered Dragoon, but this will serve for today's purposes. This is very similar to the standard rifle, except now we're at about 48 3/4 inches. And we have a slightly shorter 28 3/4 inch barrel. You can say 28.5 or 29, but you get the idea, a little bit shorter. And there's some other differences too that we'll get into, but the action and the caliber are all the same. So, the Mosin, where did this all begin? Probably one of the most famous bolt guns in America, at least in the last 20 years. In 1877, the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire decided to have a dust-up. It would only last less than 2 years, but it would really show that Russia's old Berdan primed rifles were obsolescent, because the Ottoman Empire was using much newer designs from Winchester in the USA. Well, as is quite often seen in history, after a nation sees that its weapons aren't up to date, beginning in 1882, the higher-ups in the Russian government, military, and the Tsar regime started to look to modernize Russia's standard issue infantry rifle, carbines, and so on and so forth. This would take some time. The 1880s were a time of rapid development, new inventions, new ideas, and Russia was really smart to kind of hold off through this decade and not really adopt anything because the things were changing so quickly. What they would do, however, would be get their hands on any new inventions they could to try them out and see what they liked. And around 1888, 1889, they got their hands on the French 1886 Lebel and somewhat of its cartridge. They were able to get a rifle. They weren't able to really get the design specs for the smokeless powder itself, but it wasn't a very complicated thing. This is why pretty much chemists in every nation were able to replicate some version of smokeless powder within a couple of years. So they would look at the Lebel, and then they would announce trials for a new rifle towards the end of 1889, and they would try them out in 1890. Now, really the top two contenders in these trials were Captain Sergei Mosin of the Russian Imperial Army and Mosin-Nagant, a private citizen arms developer from Belgium, who many of you probably heard of course. There were other designs in these trials, but they were all kicked out pretty quickly for one reason or another. And there were aspects of both the Nagant rifle and the Mosin rifle that the committee really liked. They liked how simple the Mosin was, both in manufacturing, field stripping, so on. This also led to great reliability and durability. Simplicity does that. On the other hand, they liked the Nagant rifle's elegance, reliable magazine, and stripper clips, which were quite a new thing in 1890. You know, Mauser had just come out with them a year or two earlier. But of course, one of the first countries to adopt a Mauser capable of taking stripper clips was Belgium. What they would ultimately decide, though, the Mosin rifle, while it had many attributes, was felt to be kind of crude and clunky, and its magazine was not ideal. Likewise, the Nagant rifle, while elegant, was also a little too complicated, too hard to disassemble, maintain, keep clean, keep reliable for what the Russian military felt it needed. Nevertheless, the committee would vote in the beginning to accept the Nagant rifle. It was a pretty close call. It wasn't quite a 50-50 split, but it was close. Call it a 55-45 split. However, the general in charge, honestly his name slips in my mind right now, remember I go off memory on this, guys, ordered that they reevaluate the Mosin rifle. Again, we have a design from a foreigner versus a design from one of our own. Also, not just a Russian, but a Russian in the army. And what was nice for the Russians at the time, since he was a member of the army, he couldn't file for patents, so on and so forth. So a lot of the stuff could become government property and even state secret. What they would do, they would pretty much take the Mosin rifle and add the Nagant magazine system. And by that I mean part of the box mag itself is Nagant designed. The interrupter that keeps more than one cartridge from feeding up at a time was from Nagant. And the stripper clip pattern was from Nagant. Those were the three elements in the original 1891. Everything else is Mosin for the most part. This bolt, this trigger system, barrel, so on and so forth. Of course, nothing is completely done by one man, but you get the idea. This bolt, while we're mentioning it, obviously it comes out very easily, as you know. Just pull the trigger, bring it back here. Try not to drop anything on the table, guys. Let me just blow it over. There we go. We have a pretty typical 2-lug bolt. It goes in vertical and then locks horizontal. It's very easy to disassemble, at least to a point. Very durable, very large. For the day, it did have a separate head, which was pretty modern thinking for 1890. There were still quite a few guns made with one-piece bolts at the time. We have an exposed cocking piece, which can serve to either recock it or as a quasi-safety. We'll get into that in a little bit later. Have a pretty typical extractor. Remember, this is feeding a rimmed round. Speaking of, 7.62 by 54 rimmed was originally a round nose projectile. Pretty typical for the day. Wasn't particularly modern, more so than, say, 8 by 50 Lebel. But we were still using a rim, and this is already after Germany had went to the rimless 8mm round. So the trigger is very simple, but also very durable. The magazine is very easy to disassemble for cleaning. Hinges down, pulls right off. This is all your magazine is. This will hold 5 rounds, as I said. Nice little design there. As you see, the gun comes apart very easily. So this would be adopted as the 3-line rifle for the .30 caliber it fired in 1891 and quickly be slated for mass production. Now, a lot of the other features in this rifle really aren't applicable to the original. If we can find a picture or two, we'll toss them up here of the original adoption pattern. It would not have an upper handguard. It would have a different style of sights for the original round nose bullet. It would also use sling swivels. We would have one mounted to the magazine. We would also have one mounted to the barrel band. And we would use different style of barrel bands, actually, early on. Now, as far as production for these guys, Russia was still a very agrarian culture society in the late 19th century. It had factories, and it was tooling up to produce these at Sestroretsk, Tula, and Izhevsk, with Tula being the Peter the Great arsenal, one of the oldest, if not the oldest in Russia. But it took time. So they turned to Châtellerault in France, MAC, who would produce about 500,000 rifles between 1892 and 1895 for Russia. They would also help set up the production line. There was quite a bit of help given to Russia at this time. Modernizing the railway system was something that comes to mind. It was a big push because Russia was an ally of France and Britain. They wanted their ally to be at least reasonably modern. So there was this push. Not to get too bogged down in details, these would go into production at Russia, and they would first see limited combat during the Boxer Rebellion in 1899. Really, their first full-scale military debut would be during the Russo-Japanese War, from 1904 to 1905. They would have over 3 million of these built by that time, so quite a large number. However, because this was in the East, which is kind of their secondary front versus Europe, there would still be quite a few of the old Berdan primer guns in service during that war. Now, somewhat ironically, they would be fighting Japanese armed with the Arisaka, and we'll save that for a different video, but it is kind of funny by the time we get to World War I. Now, after the Japanese War, there would be a series of upgrades proposed. And these would happen all between about 1904 and 1910. But one of the first we had way back around 1895 was we would add an upper handguard because it just makes sense. Next, we would go away from the sling swivels. We would first delete one, then we'd delete both. And we would go to the more common stock slot for the slings that we know. We would also update the barrel bands. And in 1908, we would introduce a new Spitzer Cartridge, 7.62 by 54R, firing a pointed Spitzer bullet. So while Russia was by no means the last to adopt a Spitzer cartridge, but not by any stretch, they were not at all the first. This was coming into vogue. Germany had adopted it. Britain had been playing around with it, so on and so forth. America, of course, had 30-06. They would join in. This required a new pattern of sight, this one here, as you see, to work with the new round. They would also introduce this reinforcing lug in the stock to handle the heavier recoil of the new cartridge, so a slightly more powerful cartridge. And then we would end up with this pattern here. To fast forward a bit, we would get into World War I. This would be standard issue in Russia. They would not have enough of them, though. They would produce them as much and as fast as they could at all 3 arsenals. But there still just weren't enough to equip all the troops. This was a very durable rifle. It worked well. It was easy to train conscripts on, but we are very long and heavy, even by the standards of World War I. We take a spike bayonet that's pretty much semi-permanent. It's not definitely a quick detach, and it's not a blade, so you can't use it for anything else. It does make for a really long pike. That's about it. So it had some pros and cons. One thing to point, because Russia could not produce enough during the war, they would contract with two American companies, Remington and Westinghouse, to build more rifles for them. Remington and Westinghouse together were supposed to build over 3 million. There's like 1.8 and 1.5. But this number was never reached, because Russia never paid for them. Imperial Russia would receive about 470,000 U.S. manufactured 1891s, but would never pay for them. And then the revolution would happen, and obviously the communists weren't paying for something that the Tsarists had committed to buy. Not to get off on too much of a tangent, but this would leave Remington, especially in America, in a lurch, because they had tooled up to make these guns for an ally of America, and they had never been compensated, so they were really in the hole. To try to help them out, the U.S. would purchase about 280,000 91s from Remington, as well as compensate them for some lost rifles and revenues and such. And these would be adopted in U.S. service as the Model 1916 and would be basically relegated as training rifles, but nevertheless are an interesting variation in the Mosin-Nagant family, something definitely worth mentioning. A lot of them, especially the Westinghouse ones, for whatever reason, would end up in Finland. When Finland would declare independence, quite a few Russian arms would be left behind. They would also purchase quite a few Russian guns from other European nations during the 1920s. But we'll do a separate video on Finnish guns, don't worry about it, because they have their own history, of course. So the long rifle would be manufactured throughout World War I, and then they would really slow as we get into the 1920s. Even though it was officially still in production, officially standard issue, in reality, they were starting to switch over to this gun here. As I said, this is a Dragoon. At least it was when it was first made. It's a little bit shorter, a little bit lighter, but not by a heck of a lot. This is about a little under 9 1/4 pounds. This is a little over 8 3/4 pounds. So we're not quite, we'll call it 1/3 pound lighter, a little bit lighter. Even when this was adopted in the 19th century, they knew that they needed something for different troops. Now, interestingly, most nations would make a carbine version. Russia did not do this, at least not at all right away. Instead, they would do kind of a cavalry rifle. Specifically, they would do two types. They would do the Cossack and the Dragoon. And the rifles themselves were the same pattern, the same length. The difference was how they were used. Also, with or without bayonet. That was really the only difference. The Cossacks not having bayonets. Dragoons were horse-mounted infantry. Now, this was not a concept unique to Russia. America would actually use it for quite a brief time before and after the Civil War. Basically, you would have people charge into battle on a horse, then dismount and use their rifle as infantry. So basically speedy infantry. Not really dissimilar to how cavalry is today with helicopters and armored personnel carriers and whatnot. You know, they dismount and then they fight. Well, so that's where this rifle, the Dragoon, comes from. A little shorter, a little lighter, but still we have rifle length. It's not quite what we consider a short rifle. We still have a few more inches on it. In addition to a shorter barrel, the Dragoon would be the first to introduce the stock slot system. The stock slots were original on the Dragoon for its different use. They also would use a different style, more modern style, what we would think of barrel band, which would later be carried over to the infantry rifle. Of course, the original version, when this was first made, would have sights like this, unprotected front blade, and this style of rear sight, and also this style of handguard. So imagine those components on this, but at this length. These would be used very heavily in World War I. They would be produced at Tula and Izhevsk, but mainly at Izhevsk during that period. It's worth pointing out right now that in 1918, the Sestretsk arsenal would close, leaving only Tula and Izhevsk. And this would be produced in reasonably large numbers throughout the 1920s by both Tula and Izhevsk. The final production run of Dragoons would be from 1930 to 1932. So they would be in production longer than the infantry rifle. Of course, they would get started a few years later. Can't quite remember when these were adopted, but it was pretty early on in the 1890s. Although they were a little slow to get them into production. I really don't want to say more in this video because it's long enough, but we will pick up with this gun in the 9130 because it's very relevant to that whole program. But I just wanted to show it here to show these are the two basic patterns, or at least sizes, of Mosin-Nagant in World War I. There was a third that was made in small numbers, but we'll save it for another video still. Yeah, the rather famous Russian Mosin-Nagant, as it's known in America. And these are very common today, thanks to large numbers of imports. Well, for more information, please tune in to part 2 and 3, and we'll go from there. If you have any questions or just want to share your own Mosin-Nagant stories, that'd be great. I always like to hear them in the comments. If you like the video, please click like. Also, check out some of our other old bolt action series. And if you haven't already subscribed and could do so, we'd really appreciate it. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.